The German Shepherd burst out of the tree line at Rock Metro Park as though something was chasing him right out of a nightmare. His golden fur was mud-caked and riddled with burrs, his ribs visible beneath patchy coat. But it was his eyes, frantic, afraid, that brought Park Ranger Mike Davidson to a standstill. In 15 years of patrolling Arkansas backcountry, Mike had encountered a lot of lost and scared dogs, but never one that had this look on its face, as if it had looked in the face of something wicked. "Easy, boy, easy," Mike spoke softly, bending low, his hand out. The poor creature shook from head to paw before falling at Mike's boots, too tired to stand, but unable to look away back in the direction of the forest. Whatever had occurred out there, whatever this dog had witnessed, it wasn't finished. Not for him. And what Max, this frightened German Shepherd, would guide officials to would haunt Arkansas for almost 3 decades. Because only 10 days before, Max hadn't been prowling around alone. He'd been the guest of Susan Williams and her boyfriend, venturing out on what should have been an idyllic Arkansas spring weekend camping trip. And now he was alone. What occurred in those woods would not only outrage the community, but also alter the way citizens thought about the wilderness safety of Arkansas. Forever. But this is where this tale becomes even more unbelievable. So get your coffee, perhaps turn down the lights, and hang in here with me. Because this one's a roller coaster. This case did not merely go cold, it imploded. There was an arrest. The town cheered. Justice had seemingly arrived. Then like that, it all fell apart. Charges were dropped. Evidence was questioned. The actual killer vanished. And for 29 long years, families were left to wonder. Was the monster who killed their loved ones still out there? Still watching? Still hunting? Now, before we go deep, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because I guarantee you, by the end of this tale, you'll never look at a serene camping trip the same again. This was a case that didn't only frighten Arkansas, it rattled the entire LGBTQ+ community nationwide. A tale of errors, heartbreak, false promises, and one father's tireless 29-year quest for justice. A quest which finally paid off in 2024, when advanced DNA technology blew the truth wide open. And when the true killer was finally unmasked, no one, not even the detectives, foresaw it. So buckle up, because this isn't just another cold case that's been solved. It's a tale of how justice delayed almost became justice denied, and how one dad's determination not to let go of his daughter was the turning point. This is the Arkansas case that proves sometimes the most vicious predators aren't hiding deep in the forest, they're closer to home. Susan Williams was one of those individuals who had her life just so. She was 24 years old and organized, reliable, and had an unassuming strength that immediately led others to trust her. Her father, Kenneth Williams, a retired mechanic from Little Rock, joked that his daughter could command a military operation if she so chose. Every plan, every detail, he'd boast to his friends. That girl never forgets a thing. Which is why what took place that balmy May weekend back in 1995 was so unexpected, so utterly out of character. Susan had been seeing Lee Wyman for perhaps 8 months, and Kenneth had never seen his daughter more carefree. Lee, 26 and from Ohio, was a veterinary technician for North Little Rock, soft-spoken and considerate, a peaceful counterpoint to Susan's adventurous nature. They were like puzzle pieces, Kenneth would say later on. Different, but they just fit. The two had a passion for the great outdoors that had first brought them together. They had met the fall before on a guided group hike through Devil's Den State Park, and since then, camping on the weekends had been their game, their refuge from the chaos of daily life. With them always, however, was Max, their faithful German Shepherd. He loved the two women just the same and saw himself as pack guardian. None of them had any idea their subsequent camping excursion would conclude in a manner that would have Arkansas history books haunted for decades to come. May 19th, 1995, it began much like any other Friday. Susan called her dad from the insurance office where she'd worked for 3 years. Her voice was bright, bubbling with that weekend excitement he loved hearing. "Dad, we're heading out to Rock Metro Park tomorrow morning." Lee found this perfect spot near the river, totally secluded. Max is going to love it. We'll be back Sunday evening. It was their standard practice. Each trip, each time, Susan phoned her dad every night at 6 o'clock on the dot. Rain, shine, happy or exhausted. That call was always made. It was their teeny little tradition since she'd left home 2 years ago. You watch yourself out there, Kenneth stated, the same thing he always said. And give Max a tummy rub from his grandpa. Susan laughed, that rich, catching laugh that could illuminate a room. Will do, Dad. Love you. Love you too, kiddo. Those were the last words Kenneth Williams would ever hear from his daughter. Saturday night arrived and departed. Kenneth checked the clock. 6:15, 6:30, 6:45. No phone call. Perhaps they got behind schedule setting up camp, he reasoned. Perhaps no cell phone reception. That could happen out there in the woods. But when 8 o'clock came and went and the phone remained quiet, that small spark of fear inside his chest developed into something more. Susan never missed a call. Ever. In 24 years, Kenneth would later recount to investigators, his voice shaking. She always called. By Sunday morning, he was running on no sleep. He'd checked his phone a dozen times through the night. He called Lee's apartment. No answer. The veterinary clinic where she worked. Nothing. By afternoon, panic had settled in. Kenneth started calling everywhere. Park ranger stations, sheriff's departments, hospitals. Anyone who might have seen a red 1992 Toyota pickup or two young women camping near Rock Metro Park. All the responses were the same. Sometimes campers spend an extra day. Cell reception is poor up there. They'll likely be home by Monday. Kenneth, however, knew his daughter, and he knew, in the pit of his stomach, that something was horribly wrong. If this story has your heart racing already, go on and give me a like, because trust me, things are going to take a dark turn pretty soon. Monday passed. Still no word. Kenneth made a formal missing persons report to the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department. He presented them with thorough descriptions of the two women, Susan and Lee, and the license plate number of the truck, as well as the equipment they had brought camping. Deputy Maria Santos took the report, observing Kenneth's trembling hands and insomnia-weary eyes. But one had to follow procedure. Grown-ups were allowed to vanish if they so chose. 48 hours wasn't alarming, but Kenneth wasn't going to sit around waiting for the system to act. His instincts were screaming that time was of the essence, and as it turned out, he was correct. By Tuesday morning, Kenneth had set in motion one of the most extensive volunteer search efforts Arkansas had ever known. It spread like wildfire in Little Rock. 2 missing young women from Rock Metro Park. A pleading dad who wants the world to help. Over 300 turned out the first day. Some were friends, some were strangers, but they shared one goal: getting those girls home. They arrived with hiking boots, flashlights, walkie-talkies, and with hearts full of resolve. Local companies provided water and sandwiches. The Arkansas Mountain Rescue Association dispatched their best crews. Even people who'd only heard about it on the radio drove in from hours away. Deputy Santos would later recall, "I've never seen anything like it. People from every walk of life, all coming together for those girls." The search area spanned over 50 square miles of dense Arkansas wilderness. Steep trails, rocky creek beds, thick forest undergrowth. Volunteers fanned out in teams, calling Susan and Lee's names until their voices went hoarse. And when they couldn't call anymore, they kept searching anyway. Every day that went by was the same soul-crushing disappointment. No sign of the red Toyota pickup, no tent, no sleeping bags, no indication that Susan Williams or Lee Wyman had ever even set foot in Rock Metro Park. For 10 long, sleepless days, Kenneth Williams existed on caffeine and hope. He hardly ate, hardly slept. His existence became a loop of phone calls, coordinating search parties, and answering the media's questions. "We're going to find them," he assured the media on day 7, his voice raspy but firm. "My Susan's a fighter." "They both are. We just have to keep looking." But when the break did come on day 10, it wasn't the kind anyone was hoping for. Park Ranger Mike Davidson was in command of a search party tramping through one of the park's most isolated, brushy sections when something caught the corner of his eye. A fleeting moment of movement, too small for a deer, too silent for a human. Then came the noise, a faint, splintered whine. Out of the trees lurched a German shepherd, muddy-littered, ribs prominent, paws bleeding. Mike stood still. "Oh my God," he breathed. Volunteer Tom Bradford, a local school teacher who'd forfeited his spring break to volunteer, took a look and grunted, "What the devil happened to that dog?" The shepherd crept up slowly, tail held back, body shuddering. When Mike knelt down and spoke softly, "Easy, boy," the dog finally surrendered, falling against his leg, shaking, too weak to even try to lift his head. It was Max, the same dog who'd walked cheerfully beside Susan and Lee just 10 days before. The team rushed him to a local vet, hoping he'd make it through the night. The inspection spoke a terrible tale. Days of not eating or drinking correctly, extreme fatigue, and something else. Something that caused every individual at that clinic to fall into stunned silence. Trace amounts of human blood on Max's fur, and not his own. What's the time where you are reading from? Because from here on in, this story gets the darkest. And you're going to want to take a breath before we venture there. Kenneth Williams was at the park an hour after Max was discovered. When he caught sight of the dog, his knees almost gave out. He folded down into the grass, hugging Max's neck as the German shepherd shoved into him, whimpering softly. Tears streamed down Kenneth's face. "He knows," he whispered. "Look at his eyes. He knows they're not coming back." That reunion, man and dog, both grasping the final living link to Susan, was one every witness remembered for years. But Max's find finally provided searchers with an actual lead. The location where he'd been discovered was almost 6 miles from any blazed trail or campsite. Deep, harsh country few ever ventured into. If Max remained close to his owners until something scared him into flight, then Susan and Lee must have been close at hand. Rescue teams took to the field once again, this time with greater urgency. And 24 hours later, one of the volunteers discovered the clue that turned the case around. Janet Morrison, a school librarian who had come in from Fayetteville to volunteer, saw something red in the brush, an out-of-place flash of color in the Arkansas woods. She stopped, thudding heart. "Back up," she radioed. Her instincts were screaming at her that she did not want to witness this by herself. By the time the others got there, they knew what she'd witnessed. A backpack. Susan's backpack. In 50 yards, they came upon the campsite, or what was left of it. The sight before searchers that afternoon was horrific beyond imagination. Susan Williams and Lee Wyman were tied up with rope, taped up with strips of their own clothing, murdered with a viciousness that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. The killer hadn't attempted to conceal the bodies. He hadn't even made an effort to conceal the evidence. This was not a robbery. This was not a crime of passion. It was calculated, it was cold, it was deliberate, and deeply personal. When word of the discovery got out, it ripped through Arkansas like a shockwave. For the LGBTQ community, already living in fear in the religious South, the terror was swift and primal. If this can happen to Susan and Lee, it can happen to anyone. Hiking clubs canceled their excursions. Families pleaded with their children not to go camping. And a feeling of dread settled over the state that would persist for years. The Arkansas backwoods, once a haven for those looking for peace and solitude, were now somewhere people were afraid to venture. The killings of Susan Williams and Lee Wyman had altered everything. But as horrific as their deaths were, what followed would taint Arkansas for decades. "We got him." Detective Ray Morrison faced a crowded press conference, the air filled with relief and tension. Cameras snapped, journalists took notes, and families hugged each other in guarded hope. "The killer of Susan Williams and Lee Wyman is where he belongs," Morrison stated, "and he's going to pay for it." His name was Danny Ray Hutchinson, 32, a drifter with a violent past. He had been accused of 2 counts of first-degree murder and federal hate crime offenses. District Attorney Patricia Hayes, a tough, respected prosecutor, pledged to pursue the death penalty. "Justice will be served," she said. Arkansas believed her for a moment. Leaders in the community supported the police. The front page of the local paper read, "Killer Caught. Justice for Susan and Lee." Kenneth Williams, facing journalists, thanked all the participating officers. The tale had apparently been brought full circle for 3 months. And then, everything fell apart. The first break occurred before trial hearings. Hutchinson's court-appointed lawyer, Marcus Webb, questioned fingerprint evidence that had been a mainstay of the case. A separate analysis found something astonishing. Fingerprints taken off a beer bottle at the scene were too worn to make any positive identification. What investigators had labeled a positive ID was actually little more than a wishful assumption. Then came the rope. Prosecutors had highlighted the rope in Hutchinson's truck as the main evidence. But forensics showed that it was not identical to the one used in the killings. Different fibers, different company. In short, a totally different rope. And just as things couldn't possibly get any worse, they did. The prosecution's best witnesses, 3 individuals who said they'd seen Hutchinson in Rock Metro Park, began to fall apart under questioning. One was intoxicated the whole weekend. Another confessed to cop-outing to prevent charges in his own case. And the third? He completely recanted, accusing police of compelling him to identify Hutchinson's picture in a lineup. You can probably anticipate where this is going. But what do you think went wrong here? Leave your theories in the comments below because this courtroom catastrophe is about to reach rock bottom. By December 1995, only 7 months since Susan and Lee were murdered, District Attorney Patricia Hayes again faced the cameras. But this time, there was no triumph in her tone. All charges against Danny Ray Hutchinson were being dismissed. Insufficient evidence, she spoke softly. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Kenneth Williams, who had spent months thinking his daughter's killer was finally incarcerated, was devastated. "They gave us false hope," he said to reporters, his voice cracking. "They paraded this guy in front of cameras and told us he was the killer, and now they're just letting him walk out. What about Susan? What about Lee? What about the real killer who is still on the loose?" The reaction among the LGBTQ+ community was even more volatile. Protesters accused the police of hurrying to wrap up the case in a hurry to quell public opinion. Outside the Pulaski County Courthouse, riots broke out. Civil rights organizations nationwide called for federal intervention. For others, it was no longer about Susan and Lee anymore. It was how fast the system had let them all down. How's the weather in your neck of the woods tonight? Because in Arkansas, the storm of controversy that had just begun to brew around this case would rage for decades. Danny Ray Hutchinson was gone from the state within a week of his release. No forwarding address, no trail. Poof. Gone. The community was left disturbed. If detectives could get it so wrong, arresting and parading the wrong guy, how could anyone have faith that the actual murderer would ever be discovered? Detective Ray Morrison's career never came back. He retired early 6 months later. District Attorney Patricia Hayes lost her re-election in a landslide. The biggest loss in county history. Even the FBI agents who were working on the case were quietly reassigned to other offices. And for Kenneth Williams, and for all families who'd ever suffered from hate and violence, the harm could never be undone. Justice hadn't only been postponed, it had been diverted. The justice system that families like Kenneth Williams had trusted had let them down in the most terrible of fashions. And out in the Arkansas woods, somewhere, the actual assassin was loose. Camouflage not by talent or guile, but by sheer ineptness on the part of those who were supposed to deliver it. What had been a beacon of hope, a case intended to demonstrate Arkansas's willingness to battle hate crimes, had turned into a stark reminder of what occurs when law enforcement acts hastily. The tale of Susan Williams and Lollie Winans was no longer one of justice. It was a warning. The wilderness became quiet once more, but the quiet was an empty one, and the fear never dissipated. By the end of 1996, the once united community of Little Rock had splintered. Grief turned into anger. Hope turned into frustration. And beneath it all lingered that chilling truth. Someone out there had gotten away with murder. Kenneth Williams aged what felt like decades in just a few short years. The man who had once been known for his easy smile and his love of tinkering with engines now seemed haunted. His tiny house in Little Rock became what appeared to be an amateur detective's war room. Walls covered in police reports, news articles, photographs, and timelines that filled the room. Every pin and thread was a tale of a father who would not give up. Years later in an interview, Kenneth's voice was both painful and defiant. "Everyone was telling me to move on, to get closure," he said. "But how do you move on when the killer of your child is still out there? How do you get closure when justice hasn't been done?" His commitment exacted a price. Friendships and family ties unraveled. His brother ceased calling. His neighbors crossed the aisle to shop elsewhere. He invested his retirement funds, more than $40,000, in private eyes, forensic specialists, and reward money. Every lead sparked hope, and each false trail reopened the pain. Yet Kenneth continued. He would call the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office every 6 months to inquire about any news. Each year, come rain or shine, he organized a memorial vigil at Rock Metro Park. Even if it was just a small group of people standing silently under the same trees Susan had laughed and camped with her friends. Kenneth Williams never gave up, not for a single day in 29 years, said retired Detective Robert Chen. Most families quit after 5. He just couldn't. But Kenneth wasn't alone transformed by the tragedy. Arkansas itself, Rock Metro Park, lively destination, family and couples hangout, suddenly became a place to be avoided. Store owners who sold camping gear saw their sales plummet sharply. The Arkansas Parks Department instituted new safety regulations, mandatory check-in, more, ranger, patrols, and even warning signs to report suspicious behavior. And for the LGBTQ plus community, the hurt went even deeper. Susan and Lollie's relationship had been an open secret, known to close friends but kept quiet from bosses, family, and the broader public. Their murders didn't just take 2 lives, they sent a chilling message to others like them. "You're not safe even here." Patricia Moss, a good friend of Susan's, remembered, "We went underground. Suddenly being visible felt dangerous. We stopped holding hands in public. We stopped going camping. The fear, it was constant." LGBTQ plus groups in Arkansas were then young and vulnerable. Most convened in secret, behind closed doors, fearing that even the expression of support would render them vulnerable to attack. Still, in whispers and tiny acts of bravery, they kept the memory of Susan and Lollie alive. This wasn't the tale of 2 women stolen too soon. It was about how an entire community discovered that even the wilderness, once a sanctuary, could turn on you. Pause beat. And as Kenneth Williams gazed out every night at the woods that ringed his town, there was one question that nagged him most. Was the killer of his daughter still out there, free to roam? Memorial services for Lollie and Susan were small, quiet, and painfully private. The community that ought to have come together to mourn together instead withdrew into isolation, each carrying their own fear and grief. Shared grief was turned into a collective silence. But as the years went by, science did bring new hope. Throughout America, cold cases that had been believed to be unsolvable were being solved by breakthroughs in forensic technology. DNA profiling was no longer on the experimental stage. It was now a powerful weapon in the war on crime. TV shows such as Cold Case Files and Unsolved Mysteries kept old cases in the public eye, reminding families like Kenneth Williams that occasionally time was on their side. Kenneth did not give up. In 2003, he asked to have the DNA from the crime scene of his daughter reprocessed with the most advanced technology available. There was finally movement, a fresh genetic profile from an unknown male suspect. It was not a match to anyone in the national database, but it was something. Then the 2000s arrived, a new era of DNA breakthroughs. Genealogical DNA testing was the next great promise by 2008. Family trees were aiding detectives in identifying suspects via distant relatives. Kenneth spent more of his savings on the expensive testing, hoping this would be it. The results? Sound science, but infuriatingly vague. Yet again, the promise of progress was followed by heartbreak. His house became a sort of repository. Piles of binders packed with reports, theories, and consultants' suggestions he couldn't possibly follow up on. Private eyes stopped by and left, each with his own hypothesis, each one eventually adding to the stack of failures. The wasted leads were agony. Hope held out long enough to sting. There were some moments that seemed cruelly movie-like in their uselessness. In 2001, a Texas man said he knew who murdered Susan and Lollie. Kenneth traveled 8 hours at night to meet the Texas Rangers, only to find the man had made it all up, using information taken from newspaper articles to negotiate a reduced sentence. In 2006, a terminally ill convict in Missouri admitted to the killings, but police quickly found out he'd been incarcerated at the time of the murders. In 2011, a so-called psychic contacted with visions of the crime. The press descended. Kenneth endured interviews and false optimism, only for it all to come apart into nothing more than reactivated hurt. And then there was 2014, the worst blow of all. A vagabond in Louisiana was arrested when his DNA seemed to match evidence. For several euphoric weeks, Kenneth thought the nightmare had ended. He even gave a press conference, having tears run down his face while he thanked police and volunteers for refusing to give up. 3 weeks later, an error in the lab was found. The guy was innocent. The case was square one again. "Every time we thought we had him, it fell apart," Kenneth said during a 2018 podcast interview. His voice had lost its firmness and passion. "But I couldn't stop." Susan deserved better. Lollie deserved better. Their families deserved answers. The years of frustration took a toll that was visible. A high blood pressure brought on a small stroke in 2010. Depression moved in. Friends would whisper that he was dying from sorrow, haunted by a case that would not leave him alone. But even as Kenneth's health weakened, Susan and Lollie's case never really went cold. It had become something of a legend among detectives and true crime buffs. Every few years, there would be a new investigator with a fresh approach, hoping to turn up something others had overlooked. Experienced detectives would call in with half-baked theories. The files bulked up. The enigmas no less maddening. Who was responsible for killing Susan Williams and Lollie Winans? And why had the killer been able to disappear so entirely? By January 2024, Arkansas was experiencing one of the state's coldest winters in decades. Kenneth Williams, 77 now, and displaying early signs of dementia, felt particularly cruel mercies of the season. His then vivacious mind sometimes faltered. His hands shook too much to prep his daughter's files in the manner in which he once had. His calls to the sheriff's office had reduced to twice yearly. After 29 years of fixation, Kenneth was starting to confront a ghastly reality. He may not live to witness justice. Then the call arrived. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran who had just been assigned to the Pulaski County Cold Case Unit, answered the phone. She possessed something that most of her colleagues didn't: a specialized training in genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary science that had cracked hundreds of cold cases nationwide since 2018. The caller was Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia laboratory famous for converting DNA into innovations. And what they would say would change it all. For months, the team at Parabon Nanolabs had been quietly working behind the scenes with a preserved DNA sample from the original crime scene. Genetic material that had been tested, retested, and reanalyzed countless times over the past 29 years, always ending in frustration. But this time, it was different. "Detective Martinez," said Dr. Ellen Gretto, Parabon's director of bioinformatics, "we found something significant in the Williams-Winans case. Utilizing a state-of-the-art process known as SNP analysis, that is, single nucleotide polymorphism testing, the type of sophisticated genetic mapping capable of drawing information from even damaged samples, the laboratory was able to create a complete genetic blueprint of the killer. It was the most accurate one ever created. Then, the game changer. Parabon entered that genetic profile into GIDmatch, a public genealogy database chock full of DNA information from millions of Americans who'd had their DNA tested through companies like 23 and Me and Ancestry DNA. And the results were astounding. The DNA of the murderer had close genetic links to various families dispersed throughout Arkansas, Tennessee, and Missouri. By creating in-depth family trees and following patterns of inheritance, Parabon's investigators reduced the list of suspects to fewer than 24. They were all men, all the appropriate age, and all with connections to Central Arkansas in 1995. But when Detective Martinez saw one name on that list, she stiffened. 58 years old, grew up in North Little Rock, employed by the Arkansas Parks Department as a maintenance supervisor, which meant he had unlimited access to Rock Metro Park and dozens of other remote areas of land throughout the state. And in 1995, Bobby Thornton had been instructed to work on the very same area of Rock Metro Park where Susan Williams and Lollie Winans were killed. Martinez went without sleep for 3 consecutive nights reading over previous reports, lists of witnesses, and interviews. How had this man who worked in the park, who knew the lay of the land, never been interviewed? How had he evaded every dragnet, every file check, every suspect list for almost 30 years? The reply was as chilling as it was straightforward. He'd been living in plain sight. In May 1995, as Kenneth Williams was coordinating volunteer search parties for his missing daughter, Bobby Thornton stood alongside him, passing out maps, recommending zones to search, consoling a heartbroken father. He had attended the memorial service for Susan and Lollie. He had given interviews to the press concerning park safety. He had even assisted law enforcement at the beginning of the investigation, all while being absolutely sure what had transpired, because he was responsible. For nearly 30 years, he'd mingled with the very individuals who were searching for justice, assimilating so well no one had ever raised an eyebrow. But Martinez was aware that genealogical proof alone would not suffice for an arrest. She required tough proof, straight-up DNA affirmation. So in February 2024, the undercover surveillance mission started. Thornton's pattern was routine: home to work, work to the local diner, diner to the hardware store, and then home again. The team tailed him for weeks, picking up discarded trash, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, even napkins, anything that could contain his DNA. Then on February 23rd, they struck pay dirt. Thornton discarded a half-finished sandwich into a park garbage can at lunchtime, the very park where, all those years before, he had terminated 2 innocent lives. The forensic technicians hurried the sample into the lab. Hours later, they had their report. The match was impeccable, not close, not high probability. The DNA from Bobby Thornton's saliva exactly matched the DNA found on Susan Williams's clothing in 1995. On March 1st, 2024, Detective Sarah Martinez picked up the phone and called Kenneth Williams. "Mr. Williams," she said softly, "I need you to sit down. We've arrested someone for Susan's murder." There was silence, 30 long seconds of it. Then Kenneth finally spoke, voice trembling. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure this time?" "Yes, sir," Martinez replied. "We're sure." For the first time in years, Kenneth Williams broke down and wept. Bobby Thornton's arrest shook Arkansas. Local TV stations interrupted programming. Social media went wild. True crime podcasters rushed to grab emergency episodes. But the greatest shock awaited. Because when investigators dug deeper into Thornton's history, they found he hadn't been just a Parks Department worker in 1995. He'd been something sinister. Bobby Thornton hadn't merely worked at Rock Metro Park. He'd been posted to the actual far-out camping area where Susan Williams and Lollie Winans had arranged their quiet weekend escape. He was familiar with every square foot of ground there, where the forest was densest, which paths were hardly trodden, and which campsites were so private that they felt secure, but at the same time exposed. And here's where things go from terrifying to infuriating. Between 1992 and 1998, a minimum of 7 women had complained against a Parks Department worker who made them feel like they were being watched, followed, or threatened. Their descriptions all fit Bobby Thornton, but none of those complaints were ever formally investigated. None were placed in his personnel file. He was shielded by silence, by bureaucracy, by that old poisonous notion that he's just being friendly. The initial inquiry in 1995 had stalled because Thornton was not viewed as a suspect. He was treated as an accommodating witness. When detectives approached him with questions, he behaved to perfection. Helpful, composed, understanding. He gave them maps, search tactics, even volunteered for the teams of volunteers. He went to Susan's funeral. "He deceived all of us," confessed retired Detective Frank Morrison, a member of the original investigation team. "He was cooperative without being intrusive. Intelligent, but not suspicious. We never questioned him. That's how predators hide in plain sight." But the true gut blow happened during Thornton's 2024 interrogation. He confessed that he had been spying on Susan and Lollie for months prior to the murders. He'd caught them camping together on several different occasions. He'd witnessed their affection, their joy, and in his warped, hate-ridden brain, deemed they had to be punished. He was a predator who used his power position to hunt victims, said District Attorney Rebecca Chen. He preyed on Susan Williams and Lollie Winans because they were a lesbian couple. This wasn't just a double homicide. It was a hate crime in its most basic, most terrifying form. The response throughout Arkansas was swift and passionate. Vigils illuminated major cities. Rainbow flags sprouted on porches that had remained silent for decades. For almost 30 years, the LGBTQ plus community existed in the shadow of terror, but now the terror finally had a name, a face, and a prison sentence to go along with it. For Kenneth Williams, though, justice was bittersweet. He felt the weight of 3 decades lift, and yet the pain remained. I shook his hand, Kenneth said through tears during a television interview. At Susan's funeral, I shook the hand of the man who killed my daughter. He looked me in the eye and told me how sorry he was for my loss. It's the type of betrayal that burns into a human being's very soul. The trial lasted only briefly, with DNA evidence that was airtight, a complete confession, and decades' worth of investigation records. Bobby Thornton entered guilty pleas to 2 charges of first-degree murder and 2 charges of hate crime enhancement. On September 15, 2024, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Kenneth Williams, frail at 77 years of age, was seated in the courtroom when the verdict was read by the judge. His hands shook as he mouthed, "Susan, baby, we got him." We finally got him. It had taken 29 years, 4 months, and 16 days, but finally justice had been delivered. The Susan Williams and Lollie Winans story will always serve as a reminder that justice may be postponed, but never silenced. The Arkansas wilderness, once tainted by fear, could finally breathe. And somewhere, wherever peace exists beyond this life, Susan and Lollie can finally rest. If you've followed this incredible journey of heartbreak, persistence, and justice, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Real cases where the truth refused to stay buried. And join me next week, because the next cold case we're covering might just be the most unbelievable one yet. Justice, as it turns out, is always worth waiting for. Kenneth Williams sat silently in the front row, while Bobby Thornton was escorted out of the courtroom in chains. The chains rang out in the room, each clank a punctuation mark to a tale that had taken almost 30 years to conclude. Thornton's jumpsuit of orange color contrasted sharply, nearly sarcastically, with the neat park ranger uniform he used to wear, the very same uniform which had made him look reliable, friendly, even heroic. At age 77, Kenneth's hands shook as he clasped a framed photograph of Susan, the same one that he'd carried for decades. It had accompanied him to every court hearing, every press conference, and every long, sleepless night when hope was all he'd had to cling to. "I can at last sleep," he said to reporters who were assembled outside the courthouse, his relief-revealing voice shaking. "For 29 years, I've gone to bed each night thinking my daughter's murderer was still out somewhere. Tonight, I know precisely where he is, and he's never leaving." The shock waves of the arrest of Bobby Thornton spread far beyond Arkansas. In a matter of weeks, parks bureaus throughout the southern United States started implementing stricter background checks on employees. The FBI launched new programs aimed at pursuing crimes against LGBTQ plus people in rural areas. Cold case detectives around the country pulled out dusty old files and posed an uncomfortable but important question. Had they overlooked somebody in uniform? For the LGBTQ plus community, Susan and Lollie's case became more than a news headline. It became a symbol, a tale of unimaginable tragedy and hard-won victory. The fear that had kept same-sex couples from Arkansas's wilderness for decades at last began to pass. By the spring of 2025, pride groups were organizing camping excursions and hiking outings in those same woods that had previously been deemed too unsafe to venture into. Rainbow flags flew for the first time since 1995 at Rock Metro Park. Susan and Lollie didn't just receive justice, said Patricia Moss, now a grandmother and longtime LGBTQ plus activist. They restored our freedom. They told us that love is greater than hate, no matter how long it takes to prove it, like 29 years. The case also served as an inspiring reminder of determination. Kenneth Williams's unshakable belief in justice, along with the miracle of contemporary genetic genealogy, had done what had once appeared impossible. It unraveled a mystery that had tormented a generation. In October 2024, Rock Metro Park dedicated a memorial bench located near the visitor center. The bronze plaque under it says simply, "Each Sunday, if the weather holds, Kenneth makes a visit to that bench. He brings with him fresh flowers, sits in silence, and speaks with his daughter of his week, of his health, of his wishes that no other family ever will have to wait 29 years for the truth." What about you? What are your thoughts on this amazing journey to justice? Have you ever had to wait years for something that eventually came full circle? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. And if you know someone who needs to see Susan and Lollie's story, please pass this video along. Because sometimes justice takes decades, but when it does arrive, it's always worth the wait.